Tonight's lecture is going to be about one of Israel's greatest military leaders, the famous Shimon Bar Kokhba, who led a courageous and heroic and ultimately successful, albeit on a temporary level, attempt to drive the Romans out of Israel and retake Jerusalem. This rebellion occurred probably around the year 132 of the Common Era. We have some questions about the specific dating, but it's certainly about 60 years after the destruction of the temple, 70 odd years after the destruction of the temple, and he actually succeeded in driving out this massive Roman army, which was incomprehensibly powerful, and the Romans, in order to push the Jews back, had to invest a phenomenal amount of men, perhaps as many as 250,000 troops, to be able to beat down this strange but persistent guerrilla force of Jews hiding out in the Judean hills. It's a rather amazing and heroic story, but it has a lot of twists and turns regarding his own personality, including the fact that many of the rabbis felt that he was actually Mashiach. They felt that he was the Messiah, the long-awaited Redeemer. None other than Rabbi Akiva, the great Rabbi Akiva, believed that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. Ultimately, however, he himself was killed, and his venture failed, and the Romans were able to enforce even a harsher punishment on the Jews and really reinforce the diaspora that had begun with the destruction of the temple in the first century. But anyways, that's the story that we're going to explore tonight. Part of our story revolves around this image, which is not so clear, I'm sorry, but I'll get a better one, I think, for next week. This is the Cave of Letters. It's a remote cave in one of the walls, the sheer cliffs that are surrounding the Dead Sea. And in 1960, the great Israeli general and archaeologist Yigal Yadin, explored these caves and discovered a tremendous cache of documents, artifacts, utensils that were hidden there by the Bar Kokhba rebels in one of their last stands. So we'll have occasion to look at the documents that were found there, the artifacts that were found there, and it will lead us as well into next week's topic as well. Okay, let's get started with the material per se. So setting the tone for the uprising, we should recall that this occurred in the context of the Emperor Hadrian's rule over Israel. Not to be confused with Herod, who we spoke about last week. Hadrian ruled from the year 117 to the year 138. And initially, his approach to the Jews and to Israel seemed to have been somewhat conciliatory. In fact, there are several legends recorded in the Talmud in which he considered rebuilding the temple, which is an amazing thing. The temple, we should remember, was not only a center of religious significance for the Jews, it was their ultimate national center as well. It was kind of like the White House, the Congress, the Capitol building, everything. It was Washington, D.C. for the Jews, and to have lost the temple meant that their very sense of national self was destroyed. So a concession by allowing them to rebuild the temple would have really meant that he had felt that Judea had been pacified and that the Jews could regain some sense of their identity, and then they could move on. Let us recall what we discussed last week, that the Roman strategy of government was one of divide et impera, dividing and ruling, where they did not like to invest massive amounts of troops and administrators to directly administer a territory. They much preferred to sort of co-opt the elite and allow them to run their own government, kind of in a Quisling fashion if you think of World War II with countries like Norway and so on. They wanted them to run their own affairs. They just said, you know, you pay us tribute and you give us the proper obeisances and we will be very happy to let you run your country. So that may have been the reasoning behind the legend surrounding his openness initially to rebuilding the temple. I'm going to read you a passage here from the Midrash, and we should understand that, you know, the rabbis who recorded the Midrashim are not trying to record historical data as we understand it today. They're primarily trying to convey religious messages, which they will couch within the context of the historical realities of their time, but they will not necessarily be They won't feel hard-bound to be completely accurate in every detail, because that's not the message that they're trying to convey. It's kind of like, if you think about the hermeneutics of the ancient texts, it's like the difference between a prescription and a love poem. A prescription has to be totally and completely exact. What drug, what dosage, how often you should take it, all those things are really important, or else a disaster can happen. A love poem, on the other hand, can employ hyperbole, it can employ similes, metaphors, all kinds of things like that. Could you imagine if your doctor said, oh, give him something sort of like Xanax, right? You can't do that. It has to be exactly Xanax or whatever it is. So these midrashic texts also are trying to convey the information like a love poem, as it were. We can't read them like prescriptions, because that's not the way they were written. Okay, so here we go. In the days of Rabbi Yoshua ben Hananiah, the Roman government, that's under Hadrian, decreed that the temple should be rebuilt. Pappus and Lulianus, these are two important rabbis at the time, set up tables from Akko to Antioch and provided for the Olim from the Galut, meaning they set up these tables principally, it seems, to allow people to start exchanging their local currencies for Israeli shekels, so that they could, because the term tables in Midrashic Hebrew means money changers. Those Kutim then went and said to the emperor, anybody know who the Kutim are? Kutim are the Samaritans. So we're going to get to them in a second. But the Kutim, and that's in the next slide actually, the Kutim and the Samaritans had a very difficult time with each other. The Kutim, or Samaritans, and the Jews proper had a difficult time with each other. I'll explain who they are in a moment. But at any rate, here, they're going to essentially ruin the plan. The Kutim then went and said to the emperor, be it known now unto the king that if this city be builded and the walls finished, I love this translation, they will not pay tribute, impost, or toll. Said he, the emperor, to them, to the Samaritans, what is to be done, seeing that I have already issued the decree? Said they to him, send to them and say, either change the site of the temple, or enlarge it by 5 cubits, or diminish it by 5 cubits. Then they will of themselves abandon the venture. Meaning that the story in this midrash is that the Samaritans, who wanted to ruin the possibility of rebuilding the temple, they said to the emperor Hadrian, can't let them have the temple. He says, what can I do? I already said I would let them have the temple. So they said to him, you know what? Then do this. Tell him you can have the temple, but you have to put it someplace else. Like the embassy can be in Tel Aviv. It can't be in Jerusalem, for example. That was a joke, sir. Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. It was not a joke, but it was like a quip. Can I keep the quips? Maybe the Latvians will stay if I have a quip or two. Okay, the other thing is, or say to them, you can have your temple, but it should be a little bit roomier. Enlarge it by 5 cubits, which is the equivalent of about 9 feet or so. Or shrink it by 5 cubits. Now, why wouldn't the Jews say, sure, let's do it? Because the temple has to be exact, right? The measurements are described in Tanakh exactly the way it is. And so by telling them, you can have the temple, but it has to be a little bit bigger, they won't be able to accept it. And so what will happen, this is the plan of the Kutim, they are Jewish, by the way. I mean, we'll see exactly how Jewish and in what context, but they ruined the pod, because the Jews would have to refuse, and ultimately Hadrian got his way. A throng of Israel had congregated in the vale of Beth Rimmon when the letters of the emperor arrived. The people began to weep. Then a spirit of revolt began to sweep through the assemblage. Some said, let a sage stand forth and calm the people. The sage would, of course, be one of the Pharisees. We talked about him last week. They said, let Rabbi Yoshua ben Hananiah stand forth, for he is a great scholar of the Torah. So then Rabbi Yoshua arose and he expounded this parable. It's a good parable. I'm going to use it on my kids. Once a lion ate of his prey, and he got a bone stuck in his throat. Said the lion, if anyone can get the bone out of my throat, he will get a reward. There came an Egyptian heron who stuck his beak into the lion's throat and pulled out the bone. Said the heron, give me my reward. Said the lion, be off with you. Go and boast that you entered the lion's mouth and got out of there safely. So it is with the Jews, says Rabbi Yoshua. We ought to be satisfied that even though we got entangled with the Romans, we got disentangled without coming to harm. Right, so the parable of the story is that even though And some elements of this may be exactly conforming to reality. That maybe Hadrian had this policy, he thought it might work, and then because of the internal conflict, specifically with the Samaritans, who were a significant force in Israel at the time, he would come to a bad end, so he decided to change his mind, and Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya, representing the Pharisees, says, you know what, it's fine. We will do without the temple as long as we can do without the Romans as well. And that was sort of the attitude of the sages in a non-revolting fashion, but you saw that there was a chorus of voices saying we should fight against the Romans for the chutzpah of asking us to change our temple. Okay, so let's just go a little further and try to figure out who are these Samaritans here. I'm sure you've heard the term, the Good Samaritan. Does anybody know the meaning of that term?
Sure.
So what is a Good Samaritan?
The Good Samaritan is met on the road by somebody in need, and I can't remember exactly.
Oh, give me the modern terminology, please. Just what do we mean by it today?
That a person is given. They give of themselves.
They're very nice. Okay, and why does that person have to be a Samaritan? What's the pshat in Samaritan?
Because of the parable.
Well, here's the parable. Basically, it occurs in the New Testament. I think it's in Luke. I'm sure a lot of my viewers will probably correct me. But what happens is there's a disciple who talks to Jesus, or it may have been actually an opponent, I can't remember, but he says to Jesus, you know, how am I supposed to love my neighbor as myself? I mean, come on, am I supposed to really do all these things? I don't see anybody doing those things, right? So Jesus says, let me give you a parable. He says, there's a guy who's like mugged, and he's like lying on the side of the road bleeding. It's this beautiful kind of like, I'm not sure who painted this, but it's sort of a Renaissance feel to it. Guy lying on the side of the road bleeding. And along comes a Kohen, a Jew, and sees him, and then passes by. Crosses the street. Then along comes a Levite, a Levi, sees him, doesn't want to deal with him, it's messy, the guy's bleeding, and everything, across the other street. And along comes a Kutim, a Samaritan, and he helps him nevertheless. He bandages him up, he takes him to a hotel, he tells the innkeeper whatever it costs, I'll pay it, I'll come back in a little while to check on him, the whole thing. And that is the Good Samaritan. But the point that we have to understand in the story is that the Samaritans and the Jews hated each other bitterly. The Samaritans were a group of people who had converted to Judaism under duress. And their whole story is described in Tanakh, that they were afraid that if they didn't convert to Judaism, they would be devoured by these lions. And so their conversion to Judaism was sort of suspect for a good 400 years. And a good part of the Talmud, tractate Brachot in particular, goes back and forth. Do we consider them Jews or not Jews? Can we count them in a minyan? If we're eating and the waiter is one of these Samaritans, can the waiter be included in zimun for the benching? They're going back and forth deciding, are they Jews or are they not Jews? And as a result, not surprisingly, the Samaritans did not like the traditional rabbinic Jews in return. Ultimately, they divided very sharply, where the Samaritans set up a temple-like cult on Har Grisim, on Mount Grisim, which is, I believe, near Nablus. It's a mountain up near Nablus, and they even to this day, by the way, Samaritans they still sacrifice on certain holidays, goats and things like that, because it's sort of like the ancient temple cult, but it is a Samaritan version. And so at that point, the rabbi said, that's it, we're not considering them Jews, they're off. And they had a tremendous fight with each other throughout the entire time. Another example of how they used to fight is the rabbis, when they would announce the new moon, they would signal to far-off communities that the new moon had been declared, so people would know when is Rosh Chodesh, when is Pesach, when is all these holidays. And they would do it by, lighting signal fires on mountaintops. And from far away you would see the fire, so you would light a fire and go on. Until the Samaritans started waiting and lighting fires on their own, on the wrong days. So it messed up the whole system, and we had to go to a printed calendar, and synagogues made a lot of money as a result, because they could print catalogs. But at any rate, so the story, Jesus' story, is only understandable in the context of the fight between the Jews and the Samaritans. It's like saying, all the people who should have helped this Jewish guy on the road, they refused to. And of all people, Dafka, it's a Samaritan who helps him. It's like saying, let's say you're stuck in a really bad neighborhood, and all of the inner city population, rich people are walking by, let's say white middle-class Americans are walking by, leave me alone. And then an inner-city resident who is dirt poor walks up and takes care of you. It's like Dafka, it's the Samaritan who helps them. Did I make that a little too long? I think so. Well, okay, thank you, Judith. All right, so anyways, there's three basic groups of Jews who are vying for authority in Israel at this point, and they have different relationship vis-a-vis Rome. The Pharisees we spoke about. The Pharisees are trying to practice this, like Yochanan ben Zakkai that we discussed the other day, they're trying to practice a sort of tactical retreat. They're trying to stay disentangled, disengaged from Rome. You leave us alone, we'll leave you alone, and they're trying to just stay out of Rome's way and manage their own Torah affairs in closed disciple circles. The Christians are being horribly persecuted, and they are being persecuted both by the Romans in a very physical and fatal way, and they're also being persecuted to a degree by the Pharisees by being excluded from the Jewish body politic. Again, remember that when I use the term Christian in the 2nd century, we're talking about a mixed population of Jews who adopt Christianity as a faith system, and their version of Christianity, Jewish Christianity if you want to call it that, is basically all the mitzvos plus belief in Jesus. And you also have a growing population, especially outside of Israel, of Gentiles who adopt Christianity, and they are practicing no mitzvot, but believing in Jesus. So it's a mixed population. It doesn't make sense?
Christians that adopt Christianity?
Well, these are Gentiles, meaning they're like Romans, Greeks, from Asia Minor, all these places, and they leave essentially paganism to become Christians, but they feel no reason to go through Judaism to get to Christianity. They go straight to Christianity, and therefore they don't pick up keeping kosher, keeping Shabbat, things like that. And there's internal struggles within the Christian world, but definitely they are united against the Romans and united against the Jews as well. I mean, the rabbinic Jews. And then finally you have these Samaritans who are trying to have some kind of engagement with the Romans and trying to betray the Jews, as we saw in that story with Hadrian. And there's a lot of conflict as a result. To a certain degree, it will affect the Bar Kokhba revolution, but I didn't include too much of it in this particular lecture. So we have basically two major accounts, non-Jewish accounts of the Bar Kokhba revolution. I'll show you with some depictions of the historians there, but there's a broad agreement on the major causes of the war. We know that civil society was breaking apart in the 3rd decade, in the 2nd decade of the 2nd century. That there was a tremendous amount of hooliganism, there was a tremendous amount of banditry, quite a bit of it actually perpetrated by Jews. We have Jewish bandits on the road throughout Israel, and the Romans are not particularly exercising much control. They're not trying to establish a Rechtsstaat, a society governed by law. They're just basically letting it become lawless as long as it doesn't affect the governing authorities. There's some amazing stories of these bandits who are kind of frum in a way. They're kind of like pious in a way. Like the Talmud describes one man who was being led off to execution, and as he is being carried away to being executed, he shouts, "Tell the widow of Shimon that I murdered him on the way to the city of Lod." I can't remember what city it was. But here he is. Why would he reveal that? Why would he say he's off being executed, and he's letting the widow of so-and-so know that he was the one who killed her husband? Yeah, good question. Anyone want to offer a suggestion? What if the body was never found? Right? So if the body was never found, then she would be an aguna. She would not be allowed to remarry. Well, if she were to remarry, right, against the rabbinic approval. So by going and shouting, "I killed him," that meant that she was no longer an aguna. She was a widow and therefore could remarry. So then the rabbis got into a big tumult. Oh my gosh, do we accept the testimony of a guy who's being let off to be executed? I mean, how reliable is that for testimony? They concluded in the woman's favor, saying that yes, the fact that he admitted to killing this guy, we would accept it in order to render her able to marry another man. But that you get a sense of the kind of confused period of the times, that here's a person who has no problem murdering another Jew, but he's about to be executed. He wants to definitely save this other woman from being an aguna. so the local governing authorities began to really crack down heavily. In particular, one individual named Tineius Rufus, or Rufus Turnus, as he's known in the Talmud, began to impose some really severe measures on the Jewish population, outlawing a lot of basic Jewish practices. There's some debate about which specific ones, the observance of the Sabbath, observance of circumcision, and so on. But there are a lot of stories of brutality from this one Turnus Rufus that certainly escalated the conflict. Now, Dio Cassius, or Cassius Dio, shown here, is a Roman historian from the late 1st century, early 2nd century, late 1st, 2nd century, early 3rd century, who wrote that the flashpoint for the revolt was specifically Hadrian's destruction of Jerusalem and its renaming as Aela Capitolina, meaning that was totally the opposite of his earlier policy of perhaps rebuilding the temple. And most historians follow Cassius Dio in their line of thinking. However, Eusebius, shown here, who is a church historian, is our other major non-Jewish source on this period, he says that actually the temple was raised, or the Aela Capitolina was renamed, Jerusalem was raised further, after the revolt, as kind of a punishment for Bar Kokhba rebellion. So historians at this point do not know exactly what was the flashpoint that caused it. One thing we do know is that Hadrian had just left Israel. He was on this kind of grand tour of the Middle East, and he left Israel, and that's obviously when the Zealots felt, okay, this is the time that we can finally rise up against the Romans. Dio Cassius says that the Jews had a unique strategy for obtaining weapons. They had a certain amount of gun control, as it were, in the ancient world. It wasn't possible for just anybody to just produce weapons. I mean, it made a lot of noise, the banging, the clanging. You had to get the raw materials and so on. And the Romans kept a tight control over the weapons that were circulating. So according to Cassius Dio, the Jews were forced to produce weapons for the Romans in their own forges and so on. And the Jews would intentionally make poor quality swords, meaning they would have a defective one every 2 or 3 swords. And they would hand these over to the Romans, and the Romans would say, "What is this garbage?" And they say, "Feh." And they would probably not say "Feh," but they would give the swords back and say, "Give us better quality swords." And according to Cassius Dio, that's how the Jews were able to accumulate a large amount of metal and a large amount of admittedly defective swords, but they were able to arm themselves. We don't have much evidence for this particular legend, but it's an interesting one. What we do have evidence of, however, is approximately 125 tunnels found to date that they were used by Bar Kokhba and his rebels. Their strategy was to build these underground tunnels throughout, in particular, Judea, but also stretching forward into Galilee. Anyway, they built these and they hid in them, and they used them, when the Romans would approach, they would go out and they would have these guerrilla attacks on the Romans, and eventually they would seize towns one at a time, fortify them. The Romans, unfortunately, had the contrary strategy, which when they finally came in to take care of the rebellion, they besieged these towns terribly, and we have some tremendous massacres as a result. But the underground tunnels were one of the major features of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and many of them are really quite ingenious and extensive in nature. One that I'll show you at the end of this lecture was actually 300 meters in length, inside a very remote cliffside, and it had 3 separate chambers and all kinds of amazing things. Okay, now the star of the rebellion literally was Shimon Bar Kokhba. His name was probably Kochba, which is probably a family name. Kochba, we're not exactly sure. But he was known as Bar Kokhba. The word Kochav in Hebrew means star. And so there was this homiletic sort of appreciation of his name, the son of a star, because there was a passage in the Bible that refers to a star that will emerge from Jacob, meaning the Messiah. Mashiach will come from the line of Jacob, and he will create this political unity of the Jews. He will be a brilliant military leader, and he will restore sovereignty to the Jews in Israel. And actually, that's what Bar Kokhba was able to achieve in his short life. However, he his ultimate betrayal of the cause, for various reasons, led to great disillusionment among the rabbis, and they referred to him in a rather derogatory fashion later as Bar Kokhba. Kazav in Hebrew means to lie. So what was once son of a star became son of a lie, because it was all for naught. At any rate, as a military leader, he was exceptionally aggressive and demanding. We have quite a few documents written in his name, letters commanding his officers to move to this place or move to that place and so on. But he was extremely abrupt and even cruel to his underlings. He would frequently refer to their punishment if they failed to follow his orders. He was insisting that his underlings are betraying the people if they do not follow his orders exactly, precisely to the letter, and then he was constantly threatening them with different things. He also had an even aggressive style vis-a-vis God, and this is something that the rabbis took him to task for, perhaps post facto, but apparently when it came to praying for their victories, he said to God, "Don't help, but don't interfere either." Meaning he said, God, stay out of it, and I will take care of it myself. A tremendous chutzpah, but you get a sense of the kind of personality of the man. At the same time, again, it's a confusing period. It's like the bandits that we spoke about earlier. We have evidence that while they were in hiding, they were specifically sending requests out for the Arba Minim, for the lulav and etrog, for the Sukkot holiday. Apparently they were extremely expensive in the Dead Sea, and they had to import them from Yerushalayim or something. But they're also very attached to traditional religious Judaism, rabbinic Judaism at the same time. There's no question that in terms of his personal character, his midos, he would not be elected chief rabbi of the year. But on the other hand, in terms of his military leadership and his brilliance as a strategist, there was unparalleled. And ultimately, he was successful in driving out the Romans. Now, it was in this context that we should understand his nomination as the Messiah, because there's a lot written about what exactly is the Messiah in the Jewish tradition, but at its fundament, the Mashiach is believed to be, and there's a discussion of two Mashiach, with two of them, one following another, but basically Mashiach is a human being in Jewish tradition, a totally human being, not the Son of God, obviously, who will lead a military victory and bring all the Jews back to the land of Israel and establish a level of security for the Jews in the Holy Land. And so everything that Bar Kokhba was doing was in fact leading to these goals, and when he finally conquered Jerusalem, it seemed that the messianic predictions were all coming true in the person of this one Bar Kokhba. According to Maimonides, who wrote the best synopsis of Jewish philosophy on what Mashiach is, of who Mashiach will be, he wrote that Bar Kokhba could have been Mashiach, but he sinned, and as a result he was killed for his sins. The sins may have included things like the very chutzpahdik attitude to God, and things like that. Akiva, the great rabbi of his times, was a follower of Bar Kokhba. Some have argued that he lobbied for him actively throughout the Jewish diaspora, but he certainly argued forcefully that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. He was not. There was multiple voices, however, among the Pharisees, and as I think I mentioned in the bulletin, Rabbi Yochanan ben Tarta said to Akiva, grass will grow from your cheeks before the Messiah comes, meaning that you're going to be dead and buried and you'll be fertilizing the grass. You can't rely on Bar Kokhba to be Mashiach. So it was not one unanimous voice among the rabbis, but Rabbi Akiva was primus inter pares. He was one of the greatest of them, so his voice was extremely important. This is, by the way, a document from some of the Bar Kokhba papers or papyri that have found itself to the present day. So here's a map showing where the revolt was centered. It did eventually spread to the north, but it was essentially in the area of Yehuda. That's around Jerusalem to the east, around the Dead Sea. The revolt started when Hadrian left town about the year 132, and as I mentioned, the strategy of Bar Kokhba was to go town by town, village by village, drive out whatever Roman troops were there, immediately take over the entire location, probably had a lot of sympathizers among the local population, dig these tunnels and fortify and get ready for the Romans to counterattack. And ultimately, going in this fashion, town by town, village by village, they were able to conquer the entire area, including Jerusalem, which was really quite an amazing achievement. Here is one of the many coins that was minted by Bar Kokhba. What they used to do is very soft, malleable metals. They would heat up Roman coins until they were kind of soft, and then they would simply stamp over the emperor's face with whatever new symbols they wanted to import. And let's have a look at some of these symbols here. Anyone recognize this structure here? The Mishkan, or I would say actually a little bit later, the Beit HaMikdash. This is the Holy of Holies, right, which was created by Herod in a kind of a neoclassical style. That's why you have the kind of Greek-style columns and things like that. So what does it mean that Bar Kokhba is putting this on his coinage? What are his values? They're clearly, very national, religious. Let's get back to Jerusalem. Let's get our temple sacrifice going. That was like a really important thing to him. This little item up here, anyone figure out what that is? I'm sorry? Not a lion. This little thing up here. I'll give you a hint. It twinkles. Star, right. And who's that? Bar Kokhba, right? So the star on top of the temple, the Bar Kokhba, his star is shining there. That's a symbol. Now this is, I believe, this is supposed to be some kind of lulav. I'm not positive about it. I may be confusing this with another coin. But again, also a religious symbol. The coinage, Mr. Rodriguez was trying to figure out the Phoenician Hebrew. These are actually old-style Hebrew letters, and they say things like Shimon, for Shimon Bar Kokhba, for the freedom of Jerusalem. I haven't been able to actually decipher these myself, but I read about them in other books, so you'll have to take my word for it. Now, so this is like the high point of the victory was the conquest of Jerusalem, which he held for possibly 3 years. But the Romans counterattacked, obviously. And they brought in troops from all over. The Romans had taken a terrible beating, so much so that in his report to the Senate, the Emperor Hadrian omitted a key phrase. Normally, when they communicate with each other, the Emperor writes, greetings to you, senators. I and my army are well. He omitted the "and my army" part, meaning because they were really taking a beating in Judea, which was, can you imagine it from the Roman perspective? They just can't deal with these Jews. I mean, every few generations they're rebelling. And who are they? It's this tiny little people. The Roman Empire extends from Scotland all the way out basically to Afghanistan, all around the Mediterranean basin, and they just can't deal with these Jews. Keep on fighting back. What's wrong with them? So he sends in 14 legions. How big is a legion? I looked it up. They vary in size, but the minimum size is about 1,000 troops. And a lot of these troops would have secondary troops attached to them, kind of like squires. So when you figure out what 14 legions mean, it's approximately, 10,000 troops. 140 to 225,000 troops were brought into Israel to quell the rebellion. We have inscriptions left by these Roman battalions and legions all over Israel when they were attacking Bar Kokhba. It was really a full court press against them. He even brought generals from Britain all the way across the Mediterranean to deal with the Jewish problem. It was definitely a major military effort by the Romans. You can compare it perhaps to, let's say, the Warsaw Ghetto Rebellion, which was also a doomed effort, that there's no way that the Jews hiding in the Warsaw Ghetto would be able to fight off the bulk of the Nazi army. But nevertheless, they made a very heroic attempt of it and sent a signal to the rest of the world. It's a very comparable kind of comparison in terms of the size of forces. So the war lasted for about 3 years. We have coinage that survived that says, Bar Kokhba, Jerusalem, year 1, Bar Kokhba, Jerusalem, year 2, and a third that may even be read year 3, and then the coinage disappears. So we're thinking that the war lasted approximately 3 years. At least Jerusalem was held for approximately 3 years, but ultimately it could not be sustained. The last stand was in Betar, which has become a symbol for Jews throughout the centuries. Betar was one of the last holdouts of the Bar Kokhba's rebels, and he had a very enthusiastic level of support from the local population. The Talmud says, oh, did we lose this image?
It'll come back.
It'll come back? Okay. The Talmud says that in Betar there were 300 school children who, if they heard the Romans were approaching, would take their styluses, their pens, and they would run out of school to poke the Romans' eyes out. Just as an illustration, the Talmud was trying to say just how deep the support was for the Bar Kokhba revolution in this town, which is, by the way, is located in a place called, I've forgotten, the Kfar al-Itil, I think I've forgotten. I'll have to look it up. I'll make a little thing on the internet. These are, by the way, some of the ruins of Betar in modern Israel. The Romans, however, besieged the city of Betar, and they simply waited out the Jews. They made sure to seal off any tunnels that may have been dug under their fortifications, and they did not engage the forces for a long time, and they basically starved them until they were forced to try and make a break for it and to open up the siege, and at which point the Romans, who had of course been well fed throughout the months and even years of the siege, they simply massacred the fighters at Betar. The Talmudic descriptions of the carnage are, incredibly hyperbolic. Like, for example, they said that the Romans rode with their horses into blood up to their necks. So it's hard to imagine what that would be like. They said that the fields around Betar were fertilized with Jewish blood for 3 years afterwards. There are all kinds of these extensive stories trying to describe how horrible the suffering was. Betar eventually fell, and one of the ironies of Jewish history, on the 9th of Av, which is kind of like the day in which so many tragedies have happened to the Jews, the destruction of the temples, actually the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto, the expulsion from Spain. It happens to be like a uniquely bad day for Jews, kind of in a sort of like National Jewish Bad Luck Day. It's a really bad time for Jews, but I shouldn't joke about it. And Betar fell on that day. The Romans, in an act of cruelty, would not allow other Jews to come and to retrieve the bodies, and they insisted on just leaving them there to rot in the August sun without burial. This lasted for approximately a week, until finally the Romans, deciding that the revolution really was at an end, they finally allowed the Jews to come and collect the bodies of the dead and to bring them to burial. At which point the rabbis instituted a blessing in the liturgy, which was read always to remember the Bar Kokhba rebellion and the subsequent burial of the martyrs at Betar. The blessing reads as follows: Blessed are you, Hashem, our God, King of the universe, the Almighty, our Father, our King, our Sovereign, our Creator, our Redeemer, our Maker, our Holy One of Jacob, our Shepherd, the Shepherd of Israel, the King who is good and who does good for all. For every single day he did good, he does good, and he will do good to us. He was bountiful with us, he is bountiful. He was bountiful with us, he is bountiful with us, and he will forever be bountiful with us, with grace and with kindness and with mercy, with relief, salvation, success, blessing, help, consolation, sustenance, support, mercy, life, peace, and all good, and of all good things may he never deprive us. Does anyone recognize where that comes from? If I read the Hebrew, you'd probably get it right away. Exactly. It's the fourth blessing in benching, the one that ends Ali Chasreinu. So the grace after meals is specifically, this one paragraph was instituted by the rabbis in memory of the massacre at Betar and the ultimate burial of the bodies. We actually have a lot of passages like that in the liturgy, where the liturgy will not specifically refer to a historical event, but it's supposed to evoke the kind of feelings that the authors wanted. Another example, for example, would be the Av HaRachamim prayer that we read on Shabbat, which is in memory of the massacres of 1096 in the Rhineland. Maybe we'll talk about it later. Rabbi Akiva lived through all of this, but 24,000 of his students famously did not. So there's a lot of discussion among historians. You know, as I'm sure you're familiar with the legend that 24,000 of Akiva's students died over one summer, and as a result, we have the period known as Sphira. Well, we call it Sphira because it coincides with a part of counting the Omer, which is Sphirata Omer, the counting of the Omer, which is basically usually, you know, it's between Passover and the holiday of Shavuot, and in that time there's roughly a month of semi-mourning. And the mourning includes, you know, no haircuts, no listening to music, things like that, no buying new clothes, and it's supposed to be in memory of Rabbi Akiva's 24,000 students who died during that time. Now the tradition does not state that they died in the Bar Kokhba rebellion, but given Akiva's support of Bar Kokhba, it stands to reason that his students would also support them. And the timing in the summer is exactly right. So some historians have opined that those 24,000 students died in battle with the Romans and not from a plague. The term plague that Talmud uses is kind of like a euphemism for the Romans. They actually may have died in combat, but that remains speculative. What is not speculative, however, is how the Romans dealt with the last elements of Bar Kokhba's supporters, including Rabbi Akiva, at which point we have what's known as the Hadrianic persecutions. Hadrian came back with a vengeance and specifically ordered 10 great rabbis killed in an extremely public and demonstrative fashion. The most infamous of those deaths, of course, was reserved for Rabbi Akiva, whose flesh was raked from his body with iron combs. Chutzpis, the translator, whose head was removed from his body and dragged about the streets of Jerusalem by a pig. You know, there are all these examples which we read actually in the liturgy. In Eila Ezkara, we read this on the holiday of Yom Kippur. We go through the story of the so-called Asara Hruge Malchut, the 10 martyrs of the state, which were those martyrs lost their lives in the immediate aftermath of the failed Bar Kokhba revolution. So we see that these events have directly affected the liturgical life of the Jew even to the present day. Now, the last element that I find really fascinating about the whole Bar Kokhba story is one of the discoveries of the caches of materials left behind by the rebels. It's in this thing called the Cave of Letters, which is an extremely inaccessible spot near the Dead Sea, even less accessible than Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. It's in a cliff face where you have to walk across these extremely dangerous little narrow paths with a 600-foot drop 6 inches away, and then you have to make this climb on a 50-foot ladder, which of course was not present back then. They used rope ladders and things like that to get to this cave with 2 entrances and a massive network of tunnels that housed entire families. The kind of materials that were found in these caves indicate that women and children lived with the rebels. I mean, you had entire families and who knows how many, maybe a few hundred people living in these caves for years. They had stocked up on water, which could only be got from about 10 miles away. There's no water otherwise. And they had evidence of ritual implements, and they had had a full religious life going on inside these caves as they're hiding from the Romans. What I found absolutely amazing, and I had not heard about this before, was buried in the entrance to that Cave of Letters was a small packet. This is it here, discovered in 1960 by the Israeli archaeological team led by General Yadin, which contained the personal correspondence of a woman named Babata. And in this personal correspondence, we have all kinds of her letters describing a custody battle she had over one of her sons, her marriage contract, legal affairs that she was involved in. Absolutely fascinating materials. These were documents that were extremely important to her, so she buried them before she was ultimately killed, we presume, by the Romans, and they were found. So 2,000 years later. So the change of topic for next week is I'd like to find out everything we can about this woman Babata and try to understand what we can learn from this about the life of women in 2nd century Israel. But let me get back to Bar Kokhba and to bring it to a conclusion. Bar Kokhba's legacy is profound and confused in some ways. Profound in that this was the last major military attempt by the Jews to regain their land in ancient times, and it would be a long 1,800 years before they would ever dream of doing this again in a real fashion. It was a heroic rebellion, it was a successful rebellion, and it ended, however badly, in a very bloody massacre at Betar. All of which we remember very profoundly in our liturgical tradition in particular. Perhaps the saddest element for the Jews, however, was the dashing of the messianic hope that Bar Kokhba represented. But at any rate, I thank you very much for your attention and your endurance. Next week we'll talk about Babata, and I hope you have a great night. Well, you made it all the way to the end of the video, so I hope that means that you really enjoyed it, or else perhaps you fell asleep at the terminal. But I just wanted to say thank you very much for watching. And, you know, I'd like to develop more of a relationship with my viewers, and so please feel free to, you know, click the like button or to leave a little comment at the bottom. I try to respond as much as possible. And if this video was useful to you, then please pass it on to someone else who might also find it so useful. Okay? Thank you very much, and have a great week.